Hey y'all, welcome to the Southern Greg Thompson Show. Today my guest will be Bill Thompson. He's my first cousin and my first guest. How about that? Enjoy the show. Well, hey everybody, and welcome to Southern Greg Thompson Show. I'm Southern Greg Thompson, and I got my very first guest on the show, and I couldn't think of anybody better to be my first guest than my first cousin, Bill Thompson. Say hey to everybody, Bill.
Hey everybody. I'm glad you chose me, bud. This is going to be a lot of fun.
This is going to be fun.
We share a whole lot of things, not just our Southern background and our family, but we've done a lot of similar stuff over the years. Of course, I think I'm a little older than you are, just a little bit.
A couple of years.
Yeah.
Now, Bill,
by the way, I got a black market haircut the other day just for this show.
Oh, you did?
Yeah, it was getting so long. My wife told me that it looked like Jimmy Swaggart, so I decided I'd get it fixed. So had a lady come to the house and cut it.
Oh, did you?
Yeah, I kept it from being illegal, I reckon.
Well, we won't tell anybody.
I had to do something, it was getting long. I tied it back in a ponytail.
Oh, don't do that now.
No. All our uncles would have come back to haunt me.
This is true. Now, everybody, Bill is right now, he's in Hallsboro, North Carolina, and that is where you were born and raised. About how far from where you are right now, from where you were raised, how far are you?
About a half a mile. But now, I was really born where you grew up.
Oh, that's right. Mm-hmm.
Your house where you grew up, the original little house, was one my mom and daddy built when I was born. And of course,
now that's interesting because I knew that Uncle Bill and Aunt Mildred built the house, but I didn't know they were still in it when you were born.
Yeah, they brought me back to Chadbourne from the hospital.
No kidding.
Yeah, stayed there 2 years before we moved to Hallsboro. So my original roots are there in Chadbourne.
Absolutely. Now, Bill talked about his uncles there. Now there were 4 brothers and a sister, in our daddy's family and our grandma. Now, did you knew Granddaddy Thompson, didn't you?
No, he died in 1945. I was just a little fella. I didn't ever know him. I heard about him. Daddy told me a lot about him, and of course, Grandmama told me a lot about him when we were growing up. So
yeah.
In my book, my latest book, I talk about him.
Oh yeah, I saw that. Now let me tell everybody a little bit more about you. Now, of course, he's a couple of years older than me. I've known Bill my whole life, and
vice versa.
What's that?
And vice versa. I've known you your whole life.
This is true. And Bill has done, I can't even begin to start all the different things he's done. He's an author. He is a speaker. He was president of the North Carolina Boys and Girls Home. Retired. You were a TV personality out of Wilmington.
Yeah.
You have sung all your life.
Yeah. Just a lot of different places. Wherever 2 or 3 gathered together.
Yeah, and you had a column in Our State magazine. For how many years did you have that column in there?
Column ran about 13 years, and then I did a series called Bill Thompson's North Carolina, where I interviewed people that wouldn't normally get their story told. My hero, was the guy that traveled for CBS. And did the on the road show.
On the road, yeah.
And that's the kind of stuff I did.
Yeah.
For the magazine.
Yeah. Do you remember the TV show Real People?
Yeah, sure do.
Well, it kind of reminds me of you doing a Southern version of Real People.
Well, that's exactly right, but that's exactly right. Some of my interviewees weren't real. They were real in that they existed, but boy, when I got to talking to them, I wondered where they came from.
Now, our home county is in southeastern North Carolina, and I've talked about people. I talked to people about Columbus County. There are numerous dialects right within our county.
Oh, absolutely. Of course, there's the Crusoe Island folks. That's the first one that comes to mind.
Yeah.
But there's even a difference in the folks who's in Western Columbus, where you grew up, and Eastern Columbus, where I am. There are a few little different pronunciations and the way we talk, but it's getting to be less and less that way now that everybody listens to television and they travel all over. A lot of those accents and stuff are kind of slipping away, but I still try to remember them anyway.
Yeah.
I've always said my accent has been an asset over the years. When I was in the television business, my employer tried to tell me to get rid of my Southern accent. And I would try. Wayne Jackson, if you remember Wayne.
I remember Wayne Jackson. Yeah.
He was my co-host on the show, and he was from Chicago, Illinois. And so he tried to get me to sound less and less Southern, and I would try it, but it wouldn't last long. I'd slip right back into it. But after a while, it turned out to be all right because I got to do, I worked with a agency in Greensboro for a while doing voiceovers, and had a lot of people from New York request my voice for voiceovers for radio in New York. And I asked the guy one time, the advertising rep that came down, and I said, why do you want a boy down here in North Carolina doing commercials in New York? He says, well, people trust the Southern accent. And I said, well, they're not too well educated then, are they?
That's funny. I did went through a similar thing, because I was in radio for years,
Yeah.
and Mary B was in radio for you at the same radio station. But
That's right. My daughter. Yeah.
Yep. And so I worked on getting rid of my Southern accent, and I thought it was funny. Folks from around Columbus County would say, Greg, you don't have a Southern accent. But when I walked out of North Carolina, people reminded me I did have a Southern accent.
I was the same. I thought I was doing really well, that I had just educated myself out of that, but it didn't happen.
Yep.
But it turned out I got paid just as much to do those Caterpillar commercials as I did the perfume ads.
That's right. That's right. Well, I tried to, I was trying to do the television movie commercial thing, and I tried my best to get rid of my Southern accent. And then after a few years, I was like, no, that's how people identify me. I'm
Right.
embracing that. I'm embracing it, and it's worked well for me.
I told somebody one time that I was proud of my Southern accent because it was full of tobacco gum and sand and salt water and all that. So I'm kind of proud of it now. I'm glad I still got it.
You know what? I talk about, a lot of people watching this may not know what tobacco gum is, but do you know what? I was fortunate. I don't believe you were as much as I was, but right at the time that I got crop and tobacco age, they came out with tobacco harvesters, and I was thankful.
Well, you were fortunate. My tobacco, working in tobacco fields, was with your daddy.
Mm-hmm.
And he was a taskmaster, buddy, as you know.
Mm-hmm.
And we had to toe the line, and that was probably the hardest work. The only other harder work I ever did for your daddy, for Leroy, was picking cucumbers. Now he had a cucumber field over there across the swamp there, and my other cousins, and you probably, I don't know, you were probably too little right back then, but Mike did. Leroy had us out there picking cucumbers, and you don't ever get in the shade picking cucumbers.
No, never.
And he would put us out there, and we would pick. And then one time I told him, I said, I'm tired of this. He says, I tell you what, I'll give you $1 for every bag you pick more than I do. Now, your daddy was a hard-working fella. Yeah. And he got down there, and pretty soon I was in the hole. I was having to pay him about to pick cucumbers.
Well, you talk in your last book about Daddy. You talk about all the brothers
Yeah,
in there, and one thing a lot of people know and a lot of people don't know is my daddy had a walking handicap,
that's right. Well, it
and
was a handicap to him.
not at all. As a matter of fact, a lot of people will correct me real quick and say your daddy did not have a handicap.
That's right.
I remember when I was little, and I don't know if I was taking that into consideration or not, but we were picking bell peppers, and I said something about outrunning him or something. I mean, you can't catch me or something. And he said, "You think you can outrun me?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "Let's race." And I said, "All right." And I was probably about 5, and we took off, and he left me.
That's right. He never let that identify him. He just went right on like. In fact, he danced. He could even dance.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely, and climb up on a tractor until he just couldn't do it anymore.
That's right. And ride horses. When we were growing up there, we had a horse there. Rusty was the horse's name, and Frank had him. My other Leroy's brother, our other uncle. And,
yeah, there was 4. Let me tell you, there was 4 brothers. Uncle Lacey, Uncle Frank, and then Bill's daddy, Uncle Bill, and my daddy, Leroy.
That's right. And Frank had the horse, and Leroy liked it so much he bought one, a Palomino. I remember. I don't know how long he had him, but he would ride with us, just like like I said. That he didn't have a handicap.
No.
He did.
So he put you down the line with picking cucumbers, huh?
Oh yeah. Well, one of the other things he did, Leroy always had a nice car.
Oh yeah,
at least one. And I forgot what year it was, but anyway, that's back when I was emceeing beauty pageants all over the country. And I went by and borrowed. He had a Thunderbird, and
I remember that. Is that a gold Thunderbird?
That's right. And that's when they were big cars. And I borrowed it because I was going to, and he let me borrow it. That I was going down to Columbia to MC a pageant for a fraternity down there. I forgot what the thing was, but they were selecting a campus queen for the University of South Carolina. And that was on a Friday. And then I was supposed to go from there down to Beaufort, South Carolina, to MC the water festival down there that weekend. So I got through with the pageant there about 9 or 10 o'clock, and I took that Thunderbird and got on Highway 20 or 26 that comes out of Columbia to go to Beaufort. And he had everything on it. He had a CB radio, had an 8-track tape player, and of course had cruise control. So I got on the CB there, and I said, "Any smokies down the road?" And voice came back and says, "No, man, it's clear all the way to Beaufort." So I set the speedometer on 80. And about 2 minutes later, a blue light came up behind me, and the guy that answered me was the highway patrolman. And he pulled me over and told me what I was doing and gave me a ticket. And he said, now, and back then in South Carolina, I don't know if you can do it now, but back then, if a patrolman stopped you in South Carolina, you could plead guilty and pay the fine, and then you wouldn't have to come back to South Carolina. So
done it many times.
Yeah, he asked me about that. Says, "Do you want to go ahead?" I said, "Yeah." "How much is the fine?" He said, $100. I said, "I ain't got $100 cash on me." He said, "How much you got?" I said, "About $70. He said, "That'll do." So I did. But the thing about that is, I got down to Beaufort and came back, and a few weeks later, I was over in Shelburne, and Leroy says, "William," that's what he called me back then. He said, "William," said, "I got my automobile insurance statement, and it's gone up about $10 a month." Says, "I got a ticket down in South Carolina." I said, "I thought when I paid that guy, that took care of it." He said, "Evidently not." So he told me that I could either pay the difference in the premium or pick cucumbers. I paid the difference. I didn't want to pick any cucumbers.
Well, tell everybody what the name of your latest book is, and I want to.
I just happen to have a copy of it, Greg.
Well, what a coincidence!
What a coincidence! It looks backwards. No, it doesn't look backwards. There it is.
No.
It's called Tuxedos and Pickup Trucks. And if that was ever an appropriate title for kind of a memoir, for me, that's it. Because I don't know how many times I've worn the tuxedo, and also how many miles I've ridden in a pickup. But that's the name of it.
Well, have you ridden in the pickup while you're wearing the tuxedo?
Yes, I have. As a matter of fact, I sure have. And a lot. That's one of the things about North Carolinians and Southerners in particular. You know, we aren't real pretentious. I mean, what you see is what you get. And I got the title for the book. I was up in Hickory, North Carolina, at a country club as a speaker there for an organization, and I was a little early and all, and I had everything set up, and I was waiting outside for the program to start, and I saw this guy drive up in an old green Dodge pickup, had mud splattered all over it, and a dog box in the back. But when he got out, he was wearing a tuxedo. That's where I got the title for this book. Because I said, man, that's North Carolina. That's the South if it ever was.
That's it. Well, I want you to remind everybody, you mentioned to me one time that whenever people think about the South, they think of usually two things. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, there's two things that I figured out I needed to work on. Was the perception that people have of us Southerners. And one of them is that we are either characters out of Deliverance or Gone with the Wind.
Uh-huh.
And that's not the case. We're actually in the middle there somewhere.
Yeah.
We aren't all out in the swamp, and we aren't all in the mansions. We're kind of in the middle there somewhere. So that's. But there's such a wide variety of Southerners. You know, when I go around the country, or used to go around the country, I'm like everybody else now that speaking engagements have come to a screeching halt. Mm-hmm. But when I'd go around, one of the things I'd always ask first was how many people in the room were native Southerners, and I'd find out and ask them to raise their hands, and there was always a lot of people that weren't, mm-hmm. but they had moved down south because mm-hmm. they found out they liked living where we grew up. And so I'd kind of give them a test sometimes. And I heard you mention earlier on your show, a live show about you might be a redneck if with mm-hmm. Jeff Foxworthy. Well, I have something similar that I use, and they hadn't called me on it yet. But you might be a North Carolinian if. And one of those things that I figured out is you might be a North Carolinian if you ever ate boiled peanuts as an entree. I know you've done that.
With a Mountain Dew. With
a Mountain Dew or a Pepsi.
or Pepsi.
Or like this iced tea that I got right. And this is iced tea. I sometimes have something different.
I'm going to ask a stupid question. Is it sweet tea?
It is definitely sweet iced tea.
You know, I was out in San Diego years ago, and we went out for lunch, and we went to a restaurant, and I was placing my order, and the waiter said, what do you have to drink? I said, sweet tea. And he looked at me and he said, what in the world is sweet tea? And I said, it's tea with sugar in it. He said, oh, you mean sweetened tea. And I'm like, well, whatever. Did you hear my story about the guy that I ordered sangria in San Francisco one time? Jackie and I stopped, and I don't drink sangria, but for some reason it sounded good to me. And I know sangria. Yeah. And I know it's, red wine with orange juice in it, nothing fancy about it. But we went into a restaurant, and I didn't know it was one of those foo-foo shishi restaurants. Mm-hmm. And the waiter came over, and he said, what can I get you? And I said, I'm going to have spring rolls. And do you have sangria? And he looked down his nose at me, and he said, no, we do not have sangria. And I said, okay, well, I'll have some tea. And I knew better than to ask for sweet tea. And he said, are you only having spring rolls? And I said, yeah. He said, "Are we not hungry today?" And I said, my first response that comes up in my head is go, "We? You got a mouse in your pocket?" But I said, not really. So he came back, Bill, I kid you not, it was a plate this big, and there were 3 spring rolls about the size of my pinky laid out. I'm not kidding you. And it was about $14. And I looked down at it, and I looked up at him, and I said, "You know what? I think I will have a bowl of clam chowder with this."
Well, I want to tell you my favorite sweet.
Whoa, I got no, that ain't the end. So he came back, and Jackie was on the other side of the table, and he came back, and he had a pitcher of tea with him, and he got next to me, and he smirked, and he said, "Would you like some more iced tea?" And Jackie was eating. She looked down, and she was like this. She was like, and I said, I looked at his name badge, and I said, "So your name's Javier, huh?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "Javier, where are you from?" He said, and this is a true story, Bill. He said, "Well, I've lived in Germany, and I've lived in Italy, and I've lived in so-and-so, and now I live here in San Francisco." I said, "Well, I'm from North Carolina." I said, "I don't make it out to the big city much." I said, "But you know what I find out?" I said, "When I make it to the big city and people hear my Southern accent, a lot of times they have a tendency to be condescending to me." And then I looked at him and I said, "Oh, condescending is a big word that means talking down to people."
Well, I had a kind of similar experience, but it was a different outcome. When I first got out of college, and I went to work for what was then called Regal Paper Company. When Regal was here, big paper company.
I've smelled them many a time.
The PR guy in the Woodlands division, and they sent me like every big company does when you go to work for them. The first thing to do, you send you off to a seminar somewhere, and they sent me to New York City, and I had never been to New York City. I had never been on an airplane, and they sent me on an airplane to New York City, and the hotel was there in Manhattan. And I got there, and I said, "Yeah, I'm gonna stay right here till I have to go home." So that night, I went downstairs to the little cafe down there in the restaurant and in the hotel, and the waitress came out, and she says, "And what do you have, sir?" And I said, and I gave her my order, and she says, "And what do you have to drink?" I said, "Tea, please." And in a little while, she came out, and she had a cup and a saucer and a little pot of hot water and a tea bag. And I thought, now what am I supposed to do with this? So I thought, and I looked around. I didn't want everybody in the restaurant to say, "This old boy doesn't know what he's doing." So I poured that hot water in the cup, and I tore open that tea bag. And I stirred and stirred and stirred. Of course, it never did dissolve. And finally, she came over to me. She says, "You not from around here, are you?" I said, "No, ma'am, I'm not."
So did she end up, did she show you how to do it?
I told her, I said, "Now, let me tell you how to fix this iced tea." And I told her, I said, "No, it's like regular tea, and you go back there and you put water and some ice cubes in there." And said, "Since you're just making it for me, if you'll bring me some little sugar, I'll sweeten my own tea." And she said, and then I said, "And if you got a slice of lemon, I'd appreciate it." She said, "You're going to get hot tea and put ice in it, and then you're going to sweeten it with sugar and then put lemon on it." I said, "Yes, ma'am." She says, "Well, I'm going to have to taste it when you get through." I said, "I'll be glad to go back there and show you how to do it."
Hey, did she ever try it?
No, but I left her a tip after. She was nice about it.
That was nice.
She wasn't condescending. She was just smart aleck.
Now, let me ask you this, and you're going to have to take a guess at this. How many beauty pageants do you think you have emceed in your life?
But I don't know. I don't know. I have no way to calculate. I started emceeing beauty pageants back in the early 70s, and I didn't slow down until they got to where it didn't need a gray-headed fat old man on a beauty pageant stage. And that was just a few years ago. But that has been, I have emceed a lot of beauty pageants. One of the things I said that, just about every girl I know that grew up in the South has been in some kind of a beauty pageant, sometime or another. And part of it has been, Miss America preliminaries. Our mutual friend, Kim Morgan Green. That's how I met her. Where she was rhododendron queen in the western part of North Carolina. And I have emceed a lot of beauty pageants, and it's been enjoyable. It's just been a nice experience to go to all these different communities and celebrate things. In North Carolina, we celebrate every green and living thing.
Everything.
A festival for everything. The one that we're most familiar with is the Strawberry Festival.
Right.
And I thought your show the other night with the reunion was just excellent.
Well, thank you, Bill.
I love that. I got to see a lot of folks' names that I didn't get to see because we didn't have the festival this year.
Yeah.
And I wrote a little column for the paper about that. And
I got it. I had several people send it to me.
Did you? Well, yeah. That was kind of it was time to have the Strawberry Festival, so we didn't want to leave it out of the paper anyway. So I wrote that in there. And but in North Carolina, we had the Strawberry Festival. The Strawberry Festival is really the oldest agricultural celebration in the state. But even here in Columbus County, we got one. Every municipality has got one. And up from Wilmington there, we've got the Spot Festival. Yeah. I have to tell people, that is not your dog's name or a period at the end of the sentence. That's fish. And
that's a fish.
That's a big deal up there.
Yeah.
And of course, we have at least two dogwood festivals. I know one in Statesville and one in Fayetteville. And
where is Hellhole Swamp?
Hellhole Swamp is just south of it's in South Carolina. And I've always wanted to MC that pageant, just so I was going to ask
you if you ever emceed.
No,
you never emceed it.
I would like to, because I would like to look. And he said that, so whoever's going to hire me said, "Well, he emceed Miss Hellhole Swamp. He must be a talented fellow." But
I got one on my resume that I'm very proud of. I have emceed the Miss Laura's Chicken Bog pageant before.
I did too. The first one. I was in the television business when they did the first one, and they called me down there to MC it, and I announced it on the air that morning that I was going to be down there that night. And some people called in. That's when I was in Wilmington, and some people called in and wanted to know what was a chicken ball. And I said, well, the main thing, if y'all come on down there tonight, you'll probably find out, because there'll be a lot of different kinds. But it was interesting. It was interesting. But my favorite one now is up at Banner Elk, the Woolly Worm Festival. Now, that's a big deal, buddy. That's a big deal.
Do they have a woolly worm queen?
Well, I thought about that when the lady called me to ask if I'd come up there and MC, and I thought, to be sure, they're not going to have a pageant for Miss Woolly Worm, because that girl she'd be embarrassed all year going out. So, well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Miss Woolly Worm. And they didn't. They had a pageant, but it was called Miss High Country or something like that.
Okay. All right. That's good.
But it was good. But I thought, it's going to be an interesting evening. And it was. It's a big deal. They have woolly worm races where they have string and the worms race up the string. They have woolly worms. The premise of it, is it's to celebrate the woolly worm, because the woollier the worm is about that time of year in the fall, the more severe the winter is supposed to be. So that's why they have the Woolly Worm Festival. And it's a big time. And of course, now some of those mountain boys stay ready. They have a look-alike contest, and it's tough.
That's some stiff competition. Huh?
Stiff. I mean, those boys stay that way all year.
Well, let me ask you this. Now, you have traveled the roads of North Carolina like nobody I've known.
Yeah.
I know you've been in every county.
Yeah.
You had to have been in every county. Do you think you have practically visited every town in North Carolina by now?
No, I haven't visited every town, but I have been in every county. Literally, we stay in North Carolina from Murphy to Manteo. Murphy's up in on the other side of Cherokee and in the mountains, and then of course Manteo is on the coast. So I've been everywhere in between. Somebody told me one time if I ever got broke, I could still travel from one end of North Carolina to the next and find somebody's house to stay in.
And they'd put a pallet on the floor for you, I'm sure.
Somewhere, yeah, and we'd have a good time. That's the thing about North Carolinians, Greg. They the most hospitable people that you'll find anywhere. Just like most Southerners, it doesn't take you long to become friends with Southerners. They take you like you are and take you in. Southern hospitality is not a false advertising at all. That's really how Southerners are.
It's a real thing, and I discovered it when I first moved to Florida, because I had so many people come up to me and tell me, "Well, I really like you. You're so nice." And I'm like, "Well, aren't you supposed to be?"
Supposed to be. That's right. Supposed to be nice. I always figured if I wasn't, my mom would hear about it, and she'd chastise me severely. So
now that's one thing. That's one thing that growing up in North Carolina, I'm going by my own experiences. If you were out somewhere else at church or somebody else's house and you misbehaved, you're going to get 2 spankings, one from the adult that is there and another one when you get home because they called your mom and told her about it.
That's right. That's exactly right. And that's good. Yeah. I like traveling around North Carolina. Like I said, I've been to so many festivals and celebrations, and I met some wonderful, wonderful people. I wouldn't take anything for the experience. One of the things that I miss though about North Carolina, the South Side in general, is, and I used to could say this in my little thing, where you might be a North Carolinian if you've ever driven down a powder dusty road as fast as you can go, just to see how big a cloud of dust you can raise. Well, I can't find many dirt roads anymore.
Not anymore.
But I still, when I get kind of down in the dumps, I get in my old truck and I find a dirt road and just kind of drive slowly down it until the mood passes.
Now, speaking of dirt roads, Roy Shade, our first cousin, Roy Shade. Yeah. Roy Shade's a year younger than me. He got his first car, and I believe it was a Toyota, and that was an unpretty car. I'm going to tell you that. And
it was unpretty.
It was unpretty, and he had 4 different colors of carpet in there, and it was a little Toyota. And I tell you, one thing we used to do was go take that thing down a dirt road, especially if it had rained a little bit, and get that thing flying all over the road with 3 or 4 of us in the car. And if it ended up in the ditch, we just jumped out, picked it up, threw it back on the road, and here we went again.
That's part of the fun of it. Well, that road where your house was on there at Grandmama's, and when I stayed over there every summer when I was growing up, and I stayed over there, and one year it was 1954, because Grandmama, after they sold tobacco, went up to Chadron to Wooten Motors and bought a brand new 54 Ford. And Frank went to pick it up and took me with him. Well, we were coming back home, and when we got to that road, it was dirt back then. Mm-hmm. And I begged Frank to let me drive the car to the house.
The road in front of Grandma's house and our house was dirt?
Yeah, that was dirt. That was dirt then. That Clarendon Chadburn Road. Yeah. It was dirt then. When you left Peacock's Crossing, it was dirt. And so Frank said, all right, you can drive it down the dirt road to the house. So I got that brand new 54 Ford, and I got in that thing, and I was going good. About the time I passed your house, which was 100 yards from Grandmama's, Frank said, you got to slow down because we're going to turn in. Well, all I did was take my foot off the gas. I didn't put on a brake. So by the time we got to Grandmama's, I was still going 50 miles an hour. And I turned in that thing, and there used to be a whole bunch of crepe myrtle trees.
Yeah.
Right there along the road. Well, I ran right into it. Brand new car, less than an hour old. And I ran into that crepe myrtle tree. And
no kid.
Frank and I weren't hurt or anything, and we got out. And I won't tell you what Grandmama said. She was not happy, but but she got on the phone right then, and she called Frank Wooten. And Mr. Wooten says, "Well, tell Frank." She said, "Will it run?" Frank said, "Yeah, it'll run." He says, "Well, bring it back to the shop." So we took it back, and he gave her another one.
No kidding.
Just like it. I think the color was blue and white, and drove it back. Frank drove it all the way home that time.
I was going to say, he wasn't going to let you drive it again.
Yeah. And, you know, Grandma told Frank then, says, "Now, we're not going to tell Bill, my daddy. We're not going to tell Bill anything about this," because she knew what would happen if she did. She never told Daddy. Never did? Never did tell him.
And you were thankful.
Oh, my goodness, I was thankful. But, Grandmama, she was unique. You know, they don't make women like Grandmama Thompson anymore.
Okay. Grandma was born in 1900.
That's right. Right at the turn of the century. And when I was living over there, we still had that big well. You know, there was a well right there behind the house, what we call a hand dug well. And
they drank water out of the well through the 70s.
That's right. And that was in the 50s and 60s when I would go over there. And that was the main water source. And when I was about 8 or 10, I reckon, I was curious about everything then, you know. And it just crossed my mind and questioned that, can chickens swim? And so I decided I'd find out. So I went out there and I cornered a couple of chickens in the pen back there and threw them in the well. Of course, they didn't swim. They just died. They drowned right there. And when Grandma got home,
that was the only source.
Well, there was a pump on the porch, you know, the old hand pump. Porch, but she still got water out of that well. And Grandmama got home, and probably the worst whipping I ever got, Grandmama gave me. And then she told Frank that we had to get those chickens out of the well.
Yeah.
So Frank tied a rope around my chest and lowered me into that well and to pull those chickens up. Now, you know, Frank was strong and he was big. Yeah. And thank goodness I was little at the time. But have you ever smelled a dead, wet chicken?
I can't say that I have.
It is not something you want to seek out. I'll guarantee you.
I didn't even think about that. I guess they drowned, huh?
Oh, yes, they did drown. Chickens can't swim, bud. Don't try it again. I'm proof that chickens can't swim. And so when I pulled those dead chickens up out of the well, and I threw them on the ground there, and Frank took the rope off my chest. I said, "Well, you reckon Grandma will fry these for us?" Frank said, "You'll be lucky if she doesn't fry your butt, boy."
Oh, my Lord.
Yeah.
I didn't think about that, about the poor chickens just drowning. I think they still be flopping around.
Chickens can't swim. What made me think they could, there was some ducks there. She had 2 ducks, and ducks were swimming. And I figured, you know, ducks are just like chickens. I never thought about the webbed feet being a factor, you know, and so I just tested it out.
Didn't work out too good.
Didn't work out. No.
Well, hey, you've got some other books that you've written. You wrote a novel too.
2 novels.
You wrote 2 novels.
The first one was called Celia Whitfield's Boy, and it won an award as a novel here in North Carolina. And it's set here in a fictional county called Bogue County.
Bogue County.
And in a little town called Flynn's Crossing, which is very similar to Hallsboro. Gotcha. And it takes place in the 1920s, during the timber boom, when all the big lumber companies moved in down here and started harvesting the timber and set up the lumber mills. And that's when Hallsboro really boomed. That's when we had 4 or 5 lumber mills and several stores. This was a busy place. And it was that way, stayed that way until they took the railroad tracks up in the 60s. And now it's just a little wide place in the road. But that's what the story is about, based on my grandfather Council, my mama's daddy.
Mm-hmm.
The character of C.U. Whitfield's boy, Jacob Whitfield, is based on my grandfather. And my grandfather was fortunate enough back then, when he was about 5 years old, my great grandmother brought him up to Hallsboro to Pearson Company. Now, people don't know where Pearson Company is. That's a landmark. It's been here since the late 19th century. And it's a big old general store, still got the wooden floors and the stamped ceilings,
Yeah,
and
if you want to take a step back in time, go to Pearson Company in Hallsboro. Just walk in the store.
it's still there, still operating. Like they still got the stamped tin ceilings and the wooden floors and the best custom meat market anybody can find anywhere. But back then, about 1918 and 19, my great grandmother Council, took my grandfather up there and asked Mr. Worth Pierce, who ran the store then, to kind of take my granddaddy on, because at that time his father had died shortly before he was born, and he had 4 sisters. So his mama had 4 older sisters and my granddaddy, and she just couldn't take care of him. So Mr. Worth Pierce raised my granddaddy.
And, I didn't know that.
Yeah, and Miss Mag Pierce had been a school teacher before she got married to Mr. Worth. And back then, if a school teacher got married, she couldn't teach school anymore. That was against the rules. You couldn't be married and teach school. So Miss Mag was right there, and she gave my grandfather the best education. I mean, she had that one-on-one teacher right there, and plus working there in the store and learning business and all that kind of stuff. And granddaddy became pretty much a scholar. I mean, he would quote Shakespeare and the Bible and everything. He was a very well-educated man for his time, particularly. And somewhere along the line, he decided he wanted to be a lawyer. And back then, you didn't have to go to law school to get to be a lawyer. No, you could apprentice yourself to an attorney and do what they call read for the law. Read the law books, work as a clerk for that attorney. And at some time when the two of you agreed that you had learned enough that you could take the bar exam, you could take it, and if you passed it, you could practice law. And so that's what my grandfather did. He never practiced law though, because about that time the Great North Carolina Lumber Company came to southeastern North Carolina, and they were looking for somebody to run the commissary down at the lumber camp at Honey Hill, which is about 4 miles south of Hallsboro, and it was in the swamp then. And they needed somebody with some business experience, but they also needed somebody with some legal experience, because whoever was going to run the store had to be the magistrate down there, because there was no law or anything. And a magistrate back then had some broad powers. They could arrest people and sentence them, all of it right there. And so that's the reason my granddaddy went down there. And so he had an unusual practice down there to serve 2 masters. One was the lumber company, so keeping the men going down there, and the other was to act as the law. So he combined the 2 parts. When the boys would get rough and rowdy on Saturday night, he would arrest them and lock them up in the back of the commissary so they were sober on Sunday morning. And then he'd put them on a little tram, a little railroad that ran from the lumber yard at Honey Hill up to Hallsboro to the mill, and would make them go to church at what's Bogue Chapel, which is a little church. It's still down here just past my house. And then after they get church, he put them back on the train and get them back, and they'd be sobered up and ready to go to work on Monday morning.
He had a method to it.
That's right.
Now this book is available on Amazon, right?
Yeah, that's C.U. Whitfield's Boy is available on Amazon. The other novel, it was called Chasing Jubal. It's set up in southwestern Virginia and northwestern North Carolina. and it's set in the 50s. When I was doing the book, C. Whitfield's Boy, I had to do a lot of research. I figured if I put one in the 50s, I could pretty much remember all that. So, so Jubal, though, is a fella who has an older brother who joins the Army in 1950. Of course, that was the middle of the Korean War.
Yeah.
And he hears about his brother going to Korea to fight. Well, he grew up there in the Shenandoah Valley, and he'd had all this Civil War history all his life. And he had heard about the brothers that would go off to fight together in the Civil War. So he thought he'd do the same thing with his brother. And so he, after his brother takes off to go to Fort Bragg for his basic training, Jubal decides that he's going to go to Fort Bragg too and go with his brother to Korea. He didn't even know where Korea was, of course. So the story is basically how Jubal's best friend tells the story of Jubal's travels and the adventures that he had, and essentially to go catch his brother. And the gist of the story, it depends a lot on the reader's ability to separate fact from fiction, the fiction that 15-year-old boys tell.
Gotcha.
You know, which can be a wide range.
Yeah.
But then you add that to 40-year recollection. So you have to, there's some mysterious characters. There's a fellow named Prince Albert. That's what he called himself, Prince Albert. I wonder where he got that name.
Yeah.
And some other characters that may or may not be real.
Gotcha.
It's up to the reader to decide. And it's a great story. I
haven't read that. I'll definitely, and that one's available on Amazon too.
All of them are still on Amazon. The
now
only
first book
that went out of print was the first one. I did when our state magazine went into book publishing business, and I was writing for our state. They asked me to write a collection of columns, which I thought meant they'd take the columns I'd been writing for the magazine and put them in a book, but that wasn't the case. I had to write 55 new columns.
Oh my land.
And it's called, and here's the title, which is, I think the reason it sold, so it's called Sweet Tea and Lazy Dogs. Front Porches, Sweet Tea and Lazy Dog.
Yeah.
And that sold, and that finally sold out. That was back about 2000, but it finally sold out. It was my best-selling book. But all my other books can still be on Amazon.
Well, that's good.
And some books,
yeah. Speaking of front porches, you like my front porch here?
looks real familiar. Looks like my front porch. Honest to goodness. When I saw that earlier this evening, I said, man, that looks like we swapped places. That looks like the front porch exactly. Yeah. Of course, my front porch is part of an old house. This old house was built in 1854. Was
it really?
Yeah. It was the first one here in Hallsboro. In fact, it was built by Mr. John Hall, who founded Hallsboro. So,
no kidding.
Yeah, it looks a lot like that one behind you there.
Well, it does. It does. If anybody wonders where Hallsboro is in North Carolina, it's in southeastern North Carolina. If you look on a map, you just look for the biggest lake between Maine and Florida, and that's where it is right there.
Now, Lake Waccamaw, it's just 4 miles away.
That's right.
Hallsboro is a unique place. Like I say, it used to be booming back in the 20s, but now it's small. We got one stoplight, and
it's a blinker.
But it's a great place. I still love it. Not many people come here on purpose. You know, they usually passing through here to go into the beach or somewhere or get lost. But it's still a great little place. It's where everybody knows everybody.
That's right. And if you do get in the area, go by Pearson Company and check that out. And if you're at Pearson Company, you'll be about 100 yards from Bill's house.
That's right. And, you know, Hallsboro is a good example of small town, southern towns. I had when I was working for our state, I had written a column one time, and I used a line in it that somebody that's writing one of these collections of quotes called the publisher, called our state and asked if they could use one of my lines in their collection. And they called me and asked me. I said, sure, how much did it pay? Which, you know, it was nothing. And so I said, but they're going to have my line in a book of quotations. So I said, all right. Well, the quotation fits Hallsboro and Chadburn and a lot of all these other towns like we grew up around. That a small town is a place where people care about you whether you want them to or not. That's where I grew up. That's where I'm living now.
That's the truth. Well, Bill, if when all this pandemic mess passes, and I do believe it will, and somebody wants you, first of all, I want to know, when people hire you to speak, what do you speak on? Do they tell you we want you to talk about this, or do they have do you have specific things?
Well, no, I talk about the South. I talk about particularly North Carolina, but I talk about the South and kind of the things that you and I have talked about, and a wide range of other things. And I talk about my books, the stories in my books, and
here's the bonus. See, I say I'm an actor, and I act like I can play the banjo and sing. Bill's a real singer, so
I sing a little bit, and tell those stories. And
well, I'm gonna ask you about one more story. You just have a good time. How can they get a hold of you if they're interested in you speaking, or performing, or emceeing,
or buy a book?
Or buy a book?
You can call me at area code 910-840-6830, or just write to Bill Thompson, Hallsboro, North Carolina, 28450, and I'll get it.
You'll get it, because I know you know the
office is right beside me here.
Yeah.
And it's just me and two or three more here, so it won't be hard to find me.
Well, they'll just come knock on your door and say, "Bill, you got a letter."
Well, she calls me sometimes and says, you got a letter down here you got to sign for. Usually, ones I got to sign for, I don't go to see nothing about them. I mean, so.
I want to share one more story, and then we're going to cut out of here. But you told me this, and I'm throwing this at you. But the gentleman from Charlotte who wrote the song "Dueling Banjos."
Yeah, the Smith.
Yes, sir. What's his first name?
Arthur
Smith. And back in the day, I'm going to say maybe early 70s, you would talk to him. He had a television show, and you talked to him about being a singer, and he told you about a new style of gospel music. You know which story I'm talking about?
Yeah, I sure do. Back then, I was working for Boys and Girls Homes back then, and we had a boys choir that I was directing, and we were taping a show right before Arthur's show at WSOC in Charlotte. And so I got to know Arthur pretty well, and people were telling me, you ought to try singing for a living. And Arthur was the man in country music back then. People left Nashville to record at his studio in Charlotte. So I asked him if he would advise me. I said, "Do you think I could make it singing?" And he said, "Well, why don't we do a tape and see?" It was a tape back then. You didn't put it on a CD or anything. So I did a little tape and left it with him. And a week or two later, I went back to Charlotte, and we went down to a little cafe for lunch. And I said, "Well, what'd you think of it?" He said, "Well, boy, you got a pretty good voice. I like your tone, and I understand you when you're singing, but it's just not commercial." I said, "What you mean?" He says, "You need something about your voice that's so distinctive that when you go on to sing, people automatically recognize your voice. And you just haven't got that distinction." And I said, "Well, I reckon I'll go back to Hallsboro then." And I left that lunch and went over to WSOC. And when I got there, Arthur had left a message for me to call him when I got to the studio. So that's back before cell phones. So I picked up the phone there in the office and called him back. He says, "Bill, just right after you left, I got a call from a friend of mine that I had sent your tape to, and he said he would like for you to come to work for him, singing full time." I said, "Oh my goodness, that's great. Who is it?" He says, "Well, I can't tell you that right now." But I said, "Well, what would I be singing?" He said, "Well, it's a new kind of music called contemporary gospel." I said, "Well, I never heard of contemporary gospel. I'd heard of Southern gospel and black gospel and all that, but I said, what is contemporary gospel? He said, well, it's kind of a cross between pop and country and other things. It's about any style of music, but it has a religious theme to it. And I said, well, I don't know, you know. And he says, the only thing is you got to tell me right now, because he's closing out today. And you have to tell me if you want this job or not. And I thought about that, and I said, you know, I don't know what I'd be getting into. I can't just give up, you know, my regular job to do this unknown thing. And I said, I'll just have to, if I got to tell you right now, I'll just have to say no. So I told him I wouldn't take the job. And like I say, when you look back on things and you wonder if you made the right determination, in that case, I think I did, because my life would have changed greatly if I'd gone to work for Jimmy and Tammy Faye Baker.
Yeah.
Which is what we want to talk about, working for PTL. Best decision I ever made.
Well, that's all right. Well, listen, hey man, I really, when I thought about doing interviews on Facebook and stuff, I said Bill's got to be the first one.
Well, I appreciate it. I really do. Yeah, and I've had a good time talking with you. We don't always get a chance to talk at family reunions. Every Thompson wants to center stage.
That's right. I really enjoyed that last time we got together, and the
grandmamas.
Yeah, I enjoy every time. So anyway, thank you for being my first guest, and it really helped set up the idea of what I want to talk about. And I'm going to tell Kim Morgan Green you said, hey, when I interview her.
Dude, tell her I still love her.
I'll do it. I'll do it. Well, listen, you be good, and I love you, and I'll talk to you later, all right?
All right, buddy. Thank you.
All right, take care. All right, bye-bye.
Hey, thanks for joining me on the Southern Greg Thompson Show. I hope you'll come back and check us out as we create more episodes. In the meantime, I appreciate you. I want you guys to have a good day and bless your heart in the good way.